Good evening, everyone. I'm joined here tonight with Keith Preston. He's been a guest on VOR before, but he's new to my show. He's written for The Alternative Right and LouRockwell.com, and he runs an organization he's the director of called the American Revolutionary Vanguard. Keith, welcome to my show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for having me on, Robert. Glad to be here.
So you've had a pretty interesting background in how your political views evolved. You came from like a Southern conservative Christian family, but then when you were growing up, you got involved in the far left. Can you kind of tell me what attracted you to the far left and sort of these leftist intellectuals like Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn and Alex Cockburn?
Okay, well, as you mentioned, I grew up among what's now called the Christian right. That was back in the 70s. I came from Lynchburg, Virginia, which was a hotbed of that kind of thinking and activity, so I grew up amidst all that during that time. When I got to be into my late teens, early 20s, I more and more realized I didn't belong in that milieu, and that is a story by itself, but that's not really particularly relevant to who I became later on. And I started drifting towards the radical left, largely because there wasn't many alternatives back then. Back then, the entire spectrum of the right was caught up in the whole Reagan era, and they had a very gung-ho Cold War type of outlook. That was an idea that I never really bought into. So I really...
And you point out you've always been a staunch anti-communist, but what exactly made you really deluded with the whole Cold War?
Well, I thought that the Cold War was essentially a mask for the projection of Western liberal imperialism into the rest of the world. I was anti-communist in the sense that I opposed communism as a system. I had a very negative, critical view of nations like the Soviet Union and Maoist China and all of that, or post-Maoist China as well. So I never was on their side, so to speak. But I always thought that the Cold War was essentially a fraudulent foreign policy undertaking, and that critique of it, of course, wasn't unique to me.
I've heard that a lot. Well, a lot of third position, and we'll get into third positionists later, but a lot of third positionists make that argument because, I'm a staunch anti-communist at well. My views have actually changed more recently. I used to believe that the Cold War was necessary, but what it really was about, the Soviet Union was not going to attack us because of the mutual self-destruction, but it was really a battle between Soviets and communism and also Western imperialism, and you could also say corporate globalism. Both of them were competing to take over, kind of spread their influence around the world on both sides. The Western imperialists and international capitalists and communists both had nefarious agendas. So I think the third positionist position of that the Cold War was kind of a sham. I've come to the same place that you have as well.
Yeah, well, that was Carl Schmitt's critique of the Cold War, the view that it was essentially an ideological war between Western liberalism and Soviet Marxism. These were simply two universalist ideologies battling for control of the world.
So you were on the left, kind of as a reaction to kind of this whole. You said the whole Reagan era and the Cold War. What really made you start to become more skeptical of the left? And after that, you got into libertarian and paleoconservatism you studied the works of Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard, and that later led you to supporting Ron Paul. And how did you kind of get into that? The Austrian School of Economics.
Well, I was interested in then as now in alternative economic ideas. Back in the 80s, I was critical of capitalism as well as Marxism and socialism. And I was always interested in alternative economic paradigms, anarcho-syndicalism and guild socialism and things like that. And that motivated me to study economic theory and so forth. And, it was through that I eventually discovered Austrian economics. And I never really became an Austrian. I never really bought the whole package of that. But I did start incorporating various insights that I picked up from that into my own outlook, even though I always sort of maintained essentially neither left nor right, a third position, or neither capitalist nor socialist economic outlook. And I still hold to views like that. I became interested in the libertarian movement in the early to mid 90s, for a number of reasons. I was interested in the rising neo-isolationist tendency in foreign policy that you found on the right.
Yeah, because you've talked. I've been reading over your site. I mean, libertarians and paleocons are the only true non-interventionists. You've talked about this war in Libya, but how the left has always been internationalist, interventionist, and the left has a lot of the left has backed these so-called humanitarian wars. In the sense, I think in a lot of ways the left claims to be anti-globalist or anti-imperialist, but I think the left has really kind of become sort of useful idiots for the globalist power structure, especially on foreign policy, by supporting these kind of so-called humanitarian adventures, and also especially on the immigration issue. So is that how you become really skeptical of the left?
What I eventually realized is that the left claimed to be anti-intervention during the Cold War, not so much because it was anti-war, anti-interventionist in principle, as much as it was simply pro-communist. Or, for example, the left, substantial sectors of the left supported the anti-Vietnam War movement because they were pro-North Vietnamese, not anti-intervention. And the same was true with the war in Central America. The same was true with other wars of that type. As you mentioned, even with the demise of the Cold War, the left has stepped up its own militarism and advocated these various wars around the world on behalf of so-called humanitarianism. Noam Chomsky called that military humanism. He's one of the people on the left that is somewhat skeptical of that kind of stuff. But yeah, I started noticing more and more that what the left was really all about when it came to that kind of issue and others. And meanwhile, as I mentioned earlier, the neo-isolationist tendency started to grow on the right among the libertarians, among the paleo-conservatives, among the Buchananites and others. So I started moving more in that camp.
And then more recently, you have your organization. It's called the American Revolutionary Vanguard, and you still hold a lot of those libertarian, paleoconservative views, but you've kind of have a syndicate of different views that some would put on the left and the right, but you've gotten to the point where you reject the whole left-right paradigm. But I want to sort of get to the ideology. I mean, you've also subscribed to national anarchism, but the overview of your site is basically anti-globalist, anti-police state. You're for localism in regards to both government and economics. Would you say that's kind of an accurate way to describe yourself and your organization?
Yeah, that's a good summary of what we're about.
Could you give us kind of more of an in-depth overview of your current political belief system and your organization?
Okay, well, American Revolutionary Vanguard was started back in the late 1990s by myself and a handful of others who had backgrounds in left-wing anarchism, left libertarianism, things like that. What we were trying to do was connect with the patriot movement as it was during that time period, because this was the 1990s and it was the era of the militias and all the different things that came out of that. And I started paying attention to the patriot movement, due to my growing interest in paleoconservatism and libertarianism and constitutionalism and things of that nature. And I started to notice that there was, in fact, a great deal of overlapping between the far right and the far left, between particularly the far populist right and the radical right and sections of the radical left, the more anarchistic left, the more non-liberal left or the libertarian left. So the purpose of American Revolutionary Vanguard was to try to build dialogue and bridges and connections between these different camps, sort of a left-right alliance against the state and against the ruling class and against the empire and globalism and all of the things that we were talking about earlier.
And you can go ahead, but that's kind of important because you just identified who really the enemies are, because the problem is conservatives. A lot of conservatives identify their main enemies as liberals and vice versa, but you identify the main adversaries as the growing police state, but that's just a byproduct. It's really this whole sort of corporate globalist banking elite power structure.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's the ruling class. You know, I'm not a Marxist. I don't agree with the kind of rigid economic determinism you see in their line of thinking. But you know, what the Marxists would call the ruling class, and that's the state, the corporate apparatus, the banking elite, and then the international institutions that all of that are connected to.
You also have described both neoconservatism and liberalism. You described them in one of your articles as the ideology of the elites.
Yes, exactly. Well, they're the left and right wing of the elite, respectively. I use a term I call totalitarian humanism to describe the prevailing ideology that we see now, you know, in the Western world, in the United States and in Western Europe and countries like Australia. And that's this idea that, you know, its historical roots are in a lot of different things, and that can get kind of complicated, but it's essentially the kind of Jacobin universalism that came out of the French Revolution, and the kind of democratic totalitarianism that you find in thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and then fused with the Marxist view of the state as merely an instrument of class power, and then superimposed on top of that is the Cultural Revolution that came out of the 1960s, where in those years the left shifted away from its traditional class-based politics towards the kind of modern identity politics you see on the left, and which dominates university, humanities departments. You know, this fascination with race, class, gender, gay, all of that kind of stuff. That's essentially where the establishment's intellectual and ideological paradigm is at today. It's this kind of belief in universal mass democracy, the omnipotent state, that the idea that the state is never wrong because it's the will of the people. It's really just sort of a modern version of a secularized version of the divine right of kings. And then this broader idea that the state is an instrument of class power, with the supposedly oppressed classes being all these disadvantaged, historically disadvantaged or perceived to be disadvantaged groups you find in the West. And that's really what cultural Marxism is. On the far right, the populist right, the nationalist right, there's a lot of discussion of the concept of cultural Marxism and where all that comes from. But essentially, it's this idea of replacing the proletariat as in the belief that the state, the totalitarian state is the agency of the proletariat, with all of the various identity groups and victim groups that you find in the left's pantheon of the oppressed.
So how does your organization, how do you address race, class, and gender issues?
Okay, well, we're, third position on that as well as everything else. When it comes to the question of race, the only public positions, or the only formal positions I take, is this concept I call separation of race and state. And that means I favor eliminating state involvement in race issues altogether. Just like nowadays, we have separation of church and state. The state more or less stays out of religious matters. People go out and organize themselves religiously however they wish. I'd favor extending that into race as well. So the state stays out of race issues, and people go out and organize themselves on race matters however they wish.
One thing when it comes to government and race, I think most cases that's pretty simple, but the one case is how would that address, when it comes to immigration, how would you address that?
Yeah, I was just getting to that. That's the second part of that, because what I lean towards when it comes to immigration is devolving control over immigration policy to the local and regional level, meaning individual communities would have to vote you in if you want to be an immigrant. Now, I think that could have mixed results, in that it's true that there are certain regions of the United States where you have the sanctuary cities, which would continue to do what they've done anyway. But I also think that in the broader geographical territory of the United States, the so-called red states and the rural areas, the smaller towns, as well as a lot of larger cities that are majority black, I think you'd see a much more restrictive, more conservative approach to immigration matters. If immigration policy was taken out of the hands of the federal government, and which is in turn controlled by this kind of multicultural, neo-Jacobin elite.
And then you give people the choice, because there's this kind of battle between ethnic separatists and people who want multiculturalism and multi-ethnic societies. But your solution, which is kind of sounds like the national anarchists and national anarchist solution is you'd give each region a choice. Some areas like LA, New York, San Francisco can be multicultural, multiracial, but places that are homogenous and want to stay homogenous have that opportunity to stay that way.
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell, yes. And that's more or less the position that most national anarchists hold to.
So you wrote an excellent article on the alternative right. It's titled White Nationalism is Not Enough, and it's your analysis of the white nationalist movements. I'll read some of the stuff briefly of what you said, is that the movement brings up a lot of legitimate issues like affirmative action, reverse discrimination, mass immigration, immigration abuse, high rates of violent crime in minority communities, formal forms of censorship associated with political correctness, state interference associated with liberties, anti-white bias in hate crime reporting, the desire for cultural self-preservation, and the double standards involved with the label racist, and the influence of foreign lobbies on U.S. policy. So basically, you say those are all legitimate issues that the so-called white nationalist movement brings up.
Yes, correct, absolutely.
But then you go on to say is that the identification of the enemy. I get a lot of white nationalists identify their enemies as people of other races, but you feel that that's one of their main faults, and you mentioned this earlier. You identify the enemy as the rulers of the institutions, the whole corporate plutocracy, the banking cartel, which runs the mass media, academia, and the legal system.
Yes, exactly. Well, one of my colleagues at American Revolutionary Vanguard said a while back that the problem with a lot of the white nationalists is that they don't recognize that not all white people are their friends and not all non-whites are their enemies. Rather, the real issue is the kind of institutional structures that are and the individuals who control those institutional structures that are perpetrating this kind of authoritarian multiculturalism, political correctness, what I call totalitarian humanism. That particular ideology is prevalent primarily among elites in the Western world, usually affluent, educated, upper middle class people, the left wing of the upper class to some degree, and scattered other populations. But primarily, this is an ideological system that elite, educated, affluent people have in the Western world, the majority of whom, by a wide margin, are white people. Now, it's also true that you have some of the more upwardly mobile or elite members of some of the minority groups who will have a similar outlook. But if you want to attack political correctness or authoritarian multiculturalism or totalitarian humanism, it's first necessary to understand who it is that actually benefits from and promotes these kind of ideas. And most of those are white people.
Yeah, absolutely. The elite, whether it's, I think there are kind of two, among the elites, they kind of work together, but you do have the more kind of the corporate elites that you bring up, and the liberal elites, who I think they're kind of, a lot of them, they've become kind of useful idiots of the corporate elites. But I mean, let's look at immigration. I think a lot of leftists have made the argument even if they're anti-imperialist, they feel that like European descended countries have to make amends for imperialism by taking in the people of the third world and voluntarily giving up their power. And there's the liberal elites. There's kind of the whole elite globalist agenda. There's definitely two wings, a sort of a corporate imperialist wing, and then there's the left wing of things. So though you kind of identify who the primary enemies are, then you go on to talk about, is it wise to push away an Elizabeth Wright, Paul Gottfried, Norman Finkelstein, David Yeagley, Carolyn Swain, Michael Hart, Michael Levin, Jesse Lee Peterson, Israel Shamir, or Meyer Schiller? So basically, you're listing people of different backgrounds who hold a lot of common political goals and views that we have.
Yeah, well, in the work that I do with projects like American Revolutionary Vanguard or AttackTheSystem.com, I work with all sorts of people of different cultural and racial, religious backgrounds, who are essentially share my views on all of these questions, or many of them. I work with black nationalists. I work with representatives of American Indian communities. I work with homosexuals. I work with people who have a background on the left, anti-war people, libertarians. Some left anarchists, some green types, a wide spectrum of people, as well as people who come from more conventionally right-wing backgrounds as well, all of whom recognize these issues to some varying degrees. And my position is that to successfully combat some of these kinds of things, that's the form that the resistance would have to take. It can't be a very narrowly focused ideological framework, whether white nationalism or paleoconservatism or libertarianism.
And you list these different movements which address the issues. You talk about the father's rights movement, the men's rights movement, family sovereignty, religious liberty, the right to bear arms, anti-tax, pro-life, national sovereignty, property rights, cultural preservation, and so many other ones, and there's just you don't want to create barriers to working with these different groups. You want to be able to have as many allies and common ground with people as you can have, because that's if you want to succeed politically, you don't want to turn people off who could be potential allies.
Yeah, well, all of the things that those kinds of movements would be in opposition to are all manifestations of the same phenomena, and that's this totalitarian humanist ideology that contemporary elites seek to promote. For example, the men's rights, fathers' rights, what they deal with to some degree is the question of the way that the organized feminist movement has taken control over the family court system. And they've worked to essentially criminalize fatherhood in some instances, and you see a lot of cases. There's a group called Radar that deals with some of this, but they focus on how men now are starting to get screwed over more and more by the family courts on issues like child custody, child support, and a lot of things. And a lot of the issues there are rooted in this kind of feminist ideology. It's radical feminist ideology that's taken root in the family courts. And then you see on the immigration issue, the mass immigration is just as harmful to the indigenous traditional minority populations in the United States as it is to the white population, if not more so. Black Americans, American Indians, the traditional Mexican American population stand to lose at least as much as white folks do.
Yeah, the only people who really benefit from this mass immigration are the elites. That's how it is.
Well, that gets back to a really good point you raised earlier, Robert, and that's you talk about how the elites have this left and right wing. The right wing is more the corporate, economic, globalist, imperialist, and then you have this kind of ideologically leftist, multicultural faction.
If you listen to John Lennon's song "Imagine," that's kind of the ideology of the left wing of the globalists. They feel that nation states nationalism leads to war and racism, and they want kind of a one world government under the UN. Then the right wing of it they're mainly driven purely by greed, corporate greed, and imperialism, and wanting. In imperialism, there's even you could say there's a left side of imperialism who supports imperialism in the name of humanitarianism, but that's all the neocons subscribe to that too. But they have ideological differences, but it's really the same kind of globalist agenda that they both subscribe to that wants to wipe out the sovereignty of nation states. So
I think what happened is that sometime in the 1970s and 80s, it seems like there was an alliance formed between the corporate globalists on the right and the PC left, where the PC left, or whatever you want to call them, more or less agreed to support the foreign policy and economic interest of the corporate right in exchange for the corporate right's support for the left social agenda, things like affirmative action, the social liberalism in the realm of things like abortion and gay rights and so forth, support for the feminist movement and that kind of thing. For example, in the Democratic Party, the Democratic Leadership Council was a group like that. They maintained a standard left liberal position on a lot of social questions, but they started moving rightward on questions of foreign policy and economic issues. And I think that right there, at least in the United States, is where things stand. It's this kind of alliance within the ranks of the elite between the cultural left, those people that, aren't so much the anti-war left or the economic left or the civil liberties left, but it's this identity politics left, that's about race and gender and gay rights and so forth, which is a movement more or less of elites within the minority groups as well as the left wing of the white upper middle class.
I mean, if you look and analyze the Republican Party, the mainstream conservative movement, the neocons, and the Democratic Party, and the establishment left, if you think about it, you look at how the Republicans are for open borders and for political correctness just as much as the Democrats, and the Democrats, I mean, they're for a lot of the same economic policies. Look how Obama supported these bailouts, and his top source of donations was from Goldman Sachs, and Obama's continued really the same foreign policy with Iraq, Afghanistan, and now we're in Libya. So there are minor differences on maybe social issues, but my basic take on these two parties is that they serve the same interests, but they cater to different political demographics. So there are minor differences, but you're absolutely right. It's this whole unholy alliance between corporate greed and cultural Marxism.
Absolutely, yes.
And so you're a pan-secessionist and a national anarchist. I want to kind of talk about how that works out practically. I'm for more local control of government and politics and economics, but I personally don't consider myself a national anarchist. I would describe myself as I'm for a constitutional republic, and I'm not a big fan of labels, but I do consider if I had to, I'd say I don't mind the label Jeffersonian populist. But those national anarchists and constitutionalist populists are definitely very close. We're very close allies.
Oh, no doubt about it. Yes, certainly.
But there are some differences. I mean, I'll be honest. I like the localism of national anarchism, but the literal definition of anarchist is to abolish government completely, and I don't see this realistic. Even one of my concerns of libertarianism is there has to be a checks and balances between government and corporations. If you reduce the government to make the government so weak, then big corporations can fill in the void. And I mean, local economies are a solution to that. So are you for abolishing the government, or do you see a need for some kind of government?
Well, as a practical matter, as you mentioned, I'm a pan-secessionist, and what I advocate are building secessionist movements at the local and regional level. And there are prototypes for that now. There's the Second Vermont Republic, which is a fairly active group. There's the Texas Nationalist Movement. There's the League of the South. There's the Cascadia group in the Northwest, and so forth. And there are others. And I view pan-secessionism as a tactic, as a strategy. It's the idea that instead of trying to address these kinds of problems by building a mass party that's going to try to get one of us elected to the presidency or something like that, or instead of trying to infiltrate the military and stage a coup or something of that nature, instead we go the other direction. We walk away from the system, and these local and regional secession movements would be the vehicles by which that was done. Now, in terms of the meaning of anarchism, in terms of do I literally advocate abolishing anything and everything that resembles government, that's one of the questions that anarchists have grappled with for generations. Because, of course, if you read a lot of anarchist literature, you'll see that anarchists are very critical of institutions like presidents and kings and parliaments and congresses and so forth. But when it comes to things like villages and syndicates and guilds and communes and all that kind of thing, they have a more ambiguous look or a more favorable view. And then, of course, the critics of anarchism will come back and say, well, isn't that really just replacing in one form of government with another? And that battle on semantic issues and ideological questions continues to be played out. As a practical matter, I favor trying to strip government down to the regional level and then to the local level. The idea of independent villages, towns, cities, regional federations of cities that can coordinate things that are better done, on some kind of large-scale level, maintenance of utilities and waterways and highways and that kind of thing. I'm not particularly rigid in my thinking on these questions. I'm not particularly doctrinaire. I've always called myself a pluralistic anarchist or an anarchist without adjectives, and that's an old term that was invented by earlier generations of anarchists to describe a point of view concerning anarchism that's very ecumenical and non-sectarian. So I don't adhere rigidly to the view that a lot of radical libertarians and anarchists, if you spend time in their discussion groups and their online chat forums, they'll ask questions about, well, is a neighborhood association a form of government? If you fire a gun at someone and don't actually hit your target, has a crime actually been committed? I don't worry about questions like that. I think that kind of thing is, it's the kind of thing that belongs in monasteries. Those aren't really practical political questions. In a nutshell, I'm in favor of radical decentralization and federations of regional federations of towns and cities and so forth.
And important to point out, not just of government, but you're also for localized economy and economic self-determination. There's this discussion of there's personal liberty and whether corporate liberty, whether corporations have that right to liberty. But I'm sure you agree with me that local communities should have economic self-determination. Like if a community decides they don't want a Walmart there, or if they don't want like new tract homes and strip malls being built, they should have a say over the character of their community. And I think local jurisdictions like states and counties and cities should have a say if they want to vote. If they want to vote to keep out certain corporations from doing business within their jurisdiction.
Yeah, absolutely. You and I would agree 100% on that. When it comes to corporations like Walmart, it's amazing how much interaction institutions like that actually have with the state. I mean, frequently when a Walmart is constructed, it's done so on land that was seized by the local government through eminent domain, and then the construction is often given subsidies and so forth. Sometimes they'll build a new highway or a new street to accommodate a Walmart or some other corporate entity of that type. The idea that the mass corporate system that we see today is some kind of free enterprise system or free market system, whatever, is absurd. And this is a really important question because when it comes to the question of libertarianism, mainstream libertarianism, one of the main criticisms of that point of view, and I think it's an entirely valid point of view, that many people, left and right, have of it, is that they will say, well, if you get rid of the government, what you're essentially doing is just moving one step down to rule by corporations. How is that any better? How is that any kind of improvement? And I would say if that's what libertarianism was about, if that was what anarchism and national anarchism was about, or at least if that's what my version of it was about, then I wouldn't be one. In no way would I advocate a system of unaccountable corporate rule. And I'll grant you there are some of the more mainstream libertarians, particularly the more Republican-friendly ones, seem to have that kind of point of view.
Yeah, I've noticed, there's different libertarian viewpoints. Like John Stossel is a libertarian, but he always takes the side of corporations if you listen to him. But there are some libertarians, even Ron Paul, who are more skeptical of big corporations. But I voted for Ron Paul, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for the guy. he speaks out against like crony capitalism, but he considers himself an authentic capitalist. But if you get to the root, it does seem that capitalism almost always leads to crony capitalism, and I think there needs to be checks and balances between government and corporations. And you're very interested in these kind of third positionist political ideologies, which I want to get into, but first thing is I want to talk about this article. You won an award from a libertarian organization in the UK for your essay, Free Enterprise and the Antidote to Corporate Plutocracy. It's a really long essay, but can you give kind of an overview about your main points in this essay about our economic system?
Well, as you mentioned, that essay involves a very long technical argument that's very abstract and theoretical. But the gist of it is that what I argue is that the plutocratic, corporatist, capitalist system that we have in the modern countries is itself a creation of the state. It's not something that could exist on its own without the state. And I mean that in the most fundamental way. For example, you were talking about the differentiation that a conventional libertarian like Ron Paul will make between crony capitalism and the supposedly good kind of capitalism. But I would go even further than that and say that the supposedly good kind of capitalism really couldn't exist without the state either. If you look at the history of the development of capitalism, going all the way back to the pre-industrial era, what you see is that the old feudal ruling classes essentially reinvented themselves as a capitalist class during the era of the Industrial Revolution. And in that essay, it's called Free Enterprise, the Antidote to Corporate Plutocracy, and it was published by the Libertarian Alliance, which is a British libertarian group, a few years ago. In that essay, I explain a little bit about the history of all this and how this happened and why it happened and how it operates. But that's the gist of my argument, is that the old feudal class was never so much abolished as much as it was reinvented as a modern capitalist class, and that system has more or less remained intact for some time, even as there have been, obviously, technological improvements and material improvements. And, in the 20th century, we saw, the rise of the modern middle class, the former working class that attained enough affluence that could live like a traditional middle class and so forth. Now, that's in reverse now. The middle class is very much under attack. But the corporate infrastructure is a creation of the state. It was created by judicial fiat in the case of the United States. It was created by other state policies in other parts of the world. The way modern capitalism developed, it varied a bit from country to country. From England to America, it took on one form, and in France and in the Asian countries, in Germany, it took on other forms. There's a lot of variation in the details. But the corporate ruling class, the state capitalist ruling class that we have today, could not exist without the support that it gets from the state. My argument is that without that apparatus of state capitalism, in terms of what kind of economic order we would have, I'm not an egalitarian, or a communist in the sense that I think everyone would be equal and we'd have a totally egalitarian society and everyone would share alike. I'm not a utopian. I don't believe in that kind of thing. But I think that in a society where this apparatus of state capitalism was removed, you'd still have a natural elite. You'd still have people.
Yeah, I'm not an egalitarian either. Some people are more intelligent. But,
exactly, yes.
But at the same time, I do think our current economic system is rigged in favor of the rich, and I hear Marxists say that, and they're correct. But I mean, if you look at capitalism and socialism, they both involve monopolies, and one's a government monopoly and corporate monopoly, and they're really quite the same on a number of issues, but I'm sure you're familiar with distributism, and distributists want to distribute capital as much as possible, and localize economies, which is excellent. And I think before capitalism, before the state interference, we kind of, and even in countries that are a little bit primitive, before capitalism was introduced, they had kind of that system where you had like the small local shopkeepers, and that was without government interference. But let's say for a distributed system to work, the reality is you're 100% correct that the government was used as a vehicle to set up the whole capitalist system, but at the same time, I think government intervention would be necessary, if you want to call it a necessary evil, as you will, to break up the system to a more what the distributists advocate, with the local economy. And I gave some examples. Like one of them is, I don't know about you, but I personally do support antitrust legislation and giving the local governments the authority to say, like, we don't want a Walmart here, we don't want these strip malls or tract homes here, and to give them an authority. And then, so would you agree that some government intervention would be necessary to fix the current corrupt, plutocratic economic system?
Well, what you're addressing, really, the question you're raising is what kind of policy should we advocate or agitate for within the context of the system we actually have. I'd address that on a number of different levels. There's one thing we can do is to agitate to strip away government policies that create these systems of artificial privilege. There's a writer on economics named Kevin Carson who deals with these issues a bit, but he once wrote an essay that I thought was very interesting called Political Program for Anarchists, and it doesn't necessarily have to be just for anarchists, but he was talking about all different sorts of ways that the system of plutocratic privilege could be attacked simply by repealing certain laws, certain policies, and so forth. The other side of that is what you're talking about as far as giving localities and regions the right to vote out corporate interests if they like. I'm all for that. I see no reason why Walmart and institutions like that should be able to set up in local communities contrary to the wishes of the people there and thereby disrupt the social fabric and organic community and cultural life and the local economic life. Antitrust legislation is not a subject that I know a great deal about. I will say this, however, my particular approach to economic theory does not necessarily imply, in fact, it certainly does not imply policies that the mainstream libertarians typically advocate. For example, they are big on this so-called free trade, which I am not. The system of free trade that, say, the Cato Institute or some of the mainstream libertarian groups and, or the Heritage Foundation, some of the mainstream conservative groups, or the Republican Party and even the Democratic Party and sectors of the left as well, advocate for, is a system of international mercantile plutocracy. And I certainly oppose that kind of approach to trade policy. If anything, I think the Buchananites have a more appropriate approach to trade policy, and that is that, given that we are in this plutocratic system and we do have this system of artificial economic privilege, that we do need to work to protect domestic industry and labor and so forth, and protect local communities and so forth, because that's what's under attack by this plutocratic order, this international plutocratic order, the system of corporate mercantilism and so forth. Advocating the so-called free trade within the economic paradigm that we actually have, is to invite further attacks by the plutocracy on the interest of labor, on the interest of small business, on the interest of domestic industry, on the interest of communities, and so forth.
Well, the thing about free trade is that we're giving away our economic sovereignty to foreign countries and becoming dependent. Our economic goal should be the economy should be as localized as much as possible, and you see that with the whole global economic collapse. Because the global economy is so tied together, if one country could collapse and it could set off a domino effect, if economies are localized, then it's more self-sufficient and sustainable, and you're not going to see that effect where there could be a nationwide or even global economic collapse.
Well, one of the reasons why America historically was one of the more prosperous nations, or the most prosperous nation for a long time, was throughout the history of its development, it essentially was an isolationist country, not just in terms of its military isolationism, but also economic isolationism. It used to be called the American system, and you had this system where you had a fairly large free trade area, very large in terms of the North American continent. But there was also efforts to protect domestic industry and labor and so forth from international trade. And then after, of course, World War II, you had this rapid, phenomenal economic expansion in the United States, and that was done largely because a lot of the competition had been wiped out in the Second World War. Europe and Asia and so forth had been left in ruins, so that left the United States holding the bag. And so that to get relevant to your point, a nation that is economically self-sufficient is able to withstand the collapse of the global economy to a much greater degree, of course, than one where everything is interdependent. And as far as what we see going on now with the global economy, what we see in the modern countries, I think particularly in the United States, it's further along than in a lot of other places, like in Western Europe, is the reproletarianization of labor. For a long time, we had an expanding middle class. We had a middle class that was achieving, or a working class that was achieving a middle class level of affluence. Now we see this process of reproletarianization, where of course, it's outsourcing and the shipping of all the domestic manufacturing overseas is starting to take place and become more prevalent. And we're converting to this service economy where everyone's working at McDonald's and Walmart for $9 an hour or something like that. What that is simply a process that's intended to reduce the domestic working class to the level of a third world working class, and to have a kind of society you see in traditional Latin American and some Asian societies. We have the very poor, you have the opulent rich, and not a whole lot in the middle. Some people have called it the Brazilianization of the American economy. That's the paleoconservatives used to use that term a lot. I know Sam Francis used that term from time to time. And what's meant by that is that in a nation like Brazil, you have this very opulently wealthy upper class that lives in gated communities. But if you go out into the wider nation, you see, a nation that's as poor as any nation. Even though it's a wealthy country in terms of natural resources and the amount of overall wealth that's inside the country. And that's the direction our society is going in. It's the direction the United States is going in. It's not going in the other direction. So it's something we definitely...
And how would you address the banking system? I mean, the financial system plays a huge role in this. I mean, I've also heard the idea of breaking up these big banking cartels and replacing them with county credit unions. And we don't even, but you know what? We don't even need government intervention, because if we just let these big banks fail instead of bailing them out, that would happen naturally. But I personally would like to see these banking monopolies broken up. You could use it possibly with antitrust legislation and replace by like county-wide credit unions or smaller banks. But the financial system is like the driving force behind, I think, most of these problems in regards to globalization.
Well, yeah, the banking bailouts from a few years ago were an incident, where the power elite in this country, stepped forward and really revealed who they are. The politicians, the Democrats and the Republicans across the spectrum, the liberal Democrats, the conservative Republicans, all were more or less united in their support for the bailout. You had Barney Frank, and you had George W. Bush all getting in line for the bailout, and that's because those are the kinds of interests that really do control the country. This kind of financial elite, this power elite. And yeah, ideally, of course, they would have let the system fail. They would have let the banking establishment fail, and we would have had a devolution of control over credit and monetary policy and so forth to localities and communities and a genuine private sector and so forth. I'm interested in a lot of different forms of alternative monetary policy. Peter Bremelow has an interesting essay. I think it's still online. He wrote it for Forbes when he was still working for them. Some years ago on free banking and on the process of competing currencies. Kevin Carson, whom I mentioned earlier, talks a little bit in some of his writings about mutual banks, which is mutualism is a complicated economic theory. It's kind of beyond what we're talking about here, but it has to do with alternative forms of exchange based on labor notes and timeshares and that kind of thing as well. And there's a lot of theories out there that have been around for years, even centuries, and that have a lot of validity to them. But I think you're absolutely correct in that the financial establishment is as much our enemy as anything out there, and the sooner that goes away, the better.
Absolutely. Well, we're close to the end. Is there anything else you'd like to say and to our audience in any way, if they're interested in learning more and getting in touch with you? You have a website.
Yeah, it's called attackthesystem.com. Attackthesystem.com. just like it sounds. On there, you can find a whole lot of essays written by me, written by a number of other people on all the topics we've been talking about on this program and more. And then there's a contact page on there as well. So if anyone wants to email me, they can do it through that contact page. And I try to answer all of my mail as much as I can. I get a lot of it, but I still try to answer all of it. And there's literally volumes of material that myself and others have written about these topics that are on that website. It can take you an awfully long time to get through the archives of the site. So if you want to find out more about what we've been talking about in this program, go to attackthesystem.com and give it a look.
Oh, thank you again. It was a pleasure having you on.
Okay, well, I'm glad to be here.
That's all we have for tonight. Take care, and we'll be back with you next week.